right, so we were talking offline. Michael was asking some direct questions about debt weapons. These are so frequently coming up, especially right now with everything changing economically and a downturn on the horizon. I thought it makes sense to just throw the camera back on. Let's go ahead and have a conversation about some of these questions and how people can start to really apply the information regarding these types of tools into their lives in order to position themselves to be as ready for the downturn as possible. Many people are expecting a really hard winter. This market crash could be pretty brutal for a lot of people, and debt weapons are going to come into the fold in that in many ways. So, I'd like to just kind of dive right into it, Michael. What were some of the questions you had heard coming up?
Yeah, so I'm talking to folks every day, just like you. I think that the economic climate right now. People, up is down, down is up. People are just, so much uncertainty. People aren't sure exactly what advice to take. So debt weapons is often something that we talk about here on the channel. Obviously, you're the expert and have been for many a year on that. They're wondering, good versus bad debt right now with economic uncertainty. Is this a good time to take on debt weapons? Is this a good time to stockpile them? Is it a good way, a good time to stay away from them? There's different schools of thought on that. I mean, what's your take? Is right now as good a time as any or a better time than ever, to stockpile debt weapons right now? And if so, why?
In many ways, yes. Let's first clarify the difference between what most people look at as good debt versus bad. Bad debt, I would say, is any type of debt that's putting more of a strain or liability onto you, whereas I look at good debt where we're using it for leverage in order to increase cash flow, the amount of money left over at the end of every month, as potentially being a much more positive type of debt. Now, I do look at the idea of good debt versus bad differently than maybe your Kiyosaki or your Dave Ramsey, where I think there's a happy medium in there. I think you could technically use debt in order to get ahead far more quickly, but doing so safely is critical. And that is more important than ever with all of the changes that we're forecasting and the potential market crash in front of us. Any type of liability in the form of debt will prove to be one of the biggest threats to your safety, just like it was in the Great Recession in 2008. So be certain that you have everything in order if you intend on actually borrowing money. And there are different categories of debt weapons. Again, debt weapons are defined as any resource that allows you to maximize your cash flow. So it's a bit of a misleading title that we trademarked because it implies that it's always a tool you borrow. There are many resources out there. I remember there was this tool that we used to use that would allow us to send these sort of funny electronic birthday and holiday cards, and they were sort of in the form of gifts. They were hilarious. I think it was called Jib Jab or something along those lines, but it was 12 bucks a year, right? And you go into the store now and you want to buy a Hallmark card, it's going to cost you $6 or $7. You do that a half a dozen times a year and you're coming out way ahead. I would consider that type of tool a debt weapon. So again, let's not allow the misleading terminology to confuse us. Anything that helps us grow our net cash flow position, we do classify as a debt weapon. The type of tool you're asking about as far as going into debt immediately would be something more along the lines of an installment loan, an automobile loan, some sort of a personal loan. I'm not necessarily as anxious to get people out there grabbing access to that type of liquidity to simply put it in the bank.
There's no return on that. There's no return on, obviously, no return on that purchase, of course. Yeah.
Unless, of course,
in most cases.
Well, what if you were to refinance your car loan and you were able to get a better rate and term? If you're able to move money from a collection of credit card balances into lower interest personal loans that are more of a fixed interest installment, that certainly would be possibly something that could make sense for you, right? You could
the adjustment on that current debt getting lower interest rates, not necessarily the origination of new installment loan debt, though.
Exactly. And the types of debt weapons I think it makes the best sense for people to be targeting as far as stockpiling is concerned are those types of lines of credit that unless you're borrowing from them, you're not actually paying any interest for it. Similar to a credit card. If your credit cards are paid in full, you're not paying interest. Now, some of those debt weapons or lines of credit actually do come with small annual fees. So there are some potential costs involved. Even on home equity lines, it's not uncommon to see a $150 annual fee in order to have that account open. Most of the time, the lenders that provide those home equity lines of credit will actually charge you an interest cost or the $150 annual fee, whichever is greater. So if you're not using the money, you'll pay the fee. If you're using it and you're paying interest, then the fee is waived. So getting access to these certain types of loans, and specifically personal and business lines of credit, home equity lines of credit and credit cards would be considered a part of this category, where you're not paying any interest unless you use the money, is generally much easier when you actually don't need the money. So when times are becoming desperate, or you come across an opportunity, which we forecast there will be plenty in the near future, over the coming years, you want to be ready to strike and strike quickly. You're going to want to have that money sitting on standby, ready to deploy. Banks hate the smell of desperation. They hate it. And it's
facts, yes. Yeah. And they can smell that a mile away too. Like they've been trained over, even through the phone, I think that they can smell that. Yeah.
It's true. And it's funny because we're still seeing various leniencies inside underwriting that I don't predict will be here as the market begins to tighten again. The underwriting climate back in 2010, 11, and 12 was much stricter than what we're seeing right now, and certainly much, much more strict than what we saw before the recession hit. And for that reason, we just have to sort of look at those historical patterns and realize that the banks are going to adjust based on the risk of default. They are always looking at the likelihood of repayment for the money that they're lending out. And the more things become challenging, the less banks are going to want to lend. So getting it in place early while the underwriting guidelines are a little more forgiving would make a lot of sense. And things like income verifications are going to be stricter. Things like credit scoring imperfections are going to be stricter. Higher loan to values are going to be more difficult to come across. And tougher banking environments are not much fun to work within if you actually do realize suddenly that having that money available for use would benefit you. So getting it now, especially if you don't need it, especially if you're qualified, is a smart decision. And I've always recommended between $25,000 up to $250,000 worth of new added available types of debt weapons every single year should be the goal.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, obviously, as the economy is continuing to head in this direction, whether we hit the full-blown recession, all indicators are that we're going to hit some way, shape, or form of a recession. The question is, how catastrophic is it ultimately going to be? But you're saying, since the money is not, you're not paying an interest rate on money unless it's deployed, basically topping off your coffers, filling up your war chest, because right now we talk about and have talked about recently is cash is king. Having access to that liquidity in the form of that HELOC or the credit card, only when you put it into play are you paying the interest rate on that, but at least you have it there on the sidelines ready to deploy. Right now, people, obviously due to high interest rates, a lot of people in the past or recently have done the cash out refinance. Right now, no one's refining, obviously, unless they had some, crazy arm recently, make no sense to adjust to a higher interest rate. So that cash out refi is not really available for folks right now, especially in that investment capacity and in short-term liquidity. But that HELOC and those credit cards are, what you're saying is the perfect time to have those at least available to you. So when those opportunities do come along, you can strike quickly.
It's true. And I have a non-owner occupied home equity line of credit on one of my rental properties that right now would be much more challenging to get access to because they're so much more limited. They were already hard to find before. And we were making videos about this years ago saying, go out and get one. Now mine hasn't frozen, it hasn't closed. But that's something to bear in mind as well. As economic conditions change, liquidity starts to tighten, banks oftentimes are going to react to that. And in some cases, they will actually take your credit away from you, regardless of whether or not you want them to. And many people who are listening have probably experienced credit cards being closed without much more than a piece of mail showing up, giving advance notice, hey, we're shutting down the account. All of my home equity lines of credit back in the last downturn were frozen. So stockpiling and having a collection is important because sometimes they're just taken away from you. And we fully expect that that's the case. So, I mean, I think it really depends on the starting point of where somebody is as to which debt weapons are best for them right now. Each and every person has a different collection of short and long-term objectives and a different starting point. And, you know, for instance, if somebody is working with less than perfect credit scores right now or a credit history, is likely going to need to target a debt weapon that is specifically designed to grow your credit. And building good credit improves cash flow. Again, this is why it's still classified as a debt weapon. And that might be something like a secured credit card or multiple.
I was going to say, yeah.
It might involve something like a utility or a rent reporter resource. It might even involve something like an authorized user strategy. I'll throw a link in the description for you on that video too, because that's one of the best techniques still available to really gain quick results to your credit, and in some cases, extreme results. So focusing on that first in order to then move to the next step of debt weapon acquisition might be important for somebody that's starting with credit scores that need a little bit of work. Whereas somebody that has a 700 or better credit score already, they could consider some of the more powerful debt weapons right out of the gate. Things like unsecured personal lines of credit or unsecured business lines of credit, some of the better credit cards. But I do want to make it very, very clear that I do not believe in a lot of this credit card shuffling or juggling game that a lot of people teach about. I don't believe in using the short-term promotional periods to go out there and make high-risk type of decisions, because if you get caught with your pants down, as the credit card companies are hoping you will be responsible for all of that interest retroactively during that promotional period, and it can come back and get you in a major way. And this is why I always discourage people from relying on credit cards as a debt weapon other than to build good credit and have access to that daily driver earning rewards, because we literally receive thousands of dollars every single year in cash back. Some people might prefer travel. Whatever your personal interest is on those rewards programs, it's extremely beneficial for me, but I literally pay my credit cards in full every single day. If there's a balance, it gets paid to zero. I don't care if it's $18, $1,800, it's paid to zero every single day. There are a number of different benefits to why I do it that way. However, just know that I always have 0% interest. I have 0% interest on my credit cards for the rest of my life because I don't revolve a balance. So if you are accessing credit cards in the form of a debt weapon vehicle, I'm not recommending that you do that in order to use that 0% promotional period to your so-called advantage and make higher risk decisions that you may not be able to pay off later. There are exceptions to that rule. I've seen it work out. I'm not saying it's as easy as black and white, but my personal preference is if you're going to use credit cards, be sure you can pay them in full every single month. So going back to some of these other types of tools, the number one thing I would tell people right now is understand what your potential equity position is on your property. Maybe have some form of a desk review done by a local agent or broker. Most agents in the area would be happy to do that if they thought they might be able to earn your business. And just know exactly what if nothing else, a Zestimate through Zillow would be an adequate starting point. Understand what the difference between that Zestimate or desk review value of your appraisal of your property is compared to what you currently owe. I would start by looking at what an 80% maximum combined loan to value, meaning if you were to take a property value of say $500,000 and multiply that through a calculation of 0.8, you'd be looking at a $400,000 maximum loan amount. That's combined loans between the first and the new home equity line of credit. If you currently owe say $300,000 on the property, that would mean that you would have eligibility of $100,000 to 80% combined loan to value. Very important to know that some lenders up until recently were happy to still go to 90%, maybe even higher in some rare cases. That's combined loan to value. But that's really where you're going to run the higher risk of those types of loans being closed first or frozen when the crash begins to take place. You will start to see banks protecting themselves as that value of your collateral dips. They will no longer give you access. So if you haven't borrowed from it and you were hoping it was just going to be sitting there available to you for use at any time, you may wake up one day and be disappointed about that. All right, so that video went a lot longer than I expected it would. There's obviously a lot of information to talk about when you're discussing the topic of debt weapons and how these tools can help serve you and where to be careful by using them. But continue to stay tuned into the channel. We're going to continue to have as much new content as possible as the times continue to change and how it relates to these extremely powerful tools and how they may be able to serve you, not just to survive this really difficult upcoming market crash, but to thrive during it as well. This could end up proving to be the one or the two tools that end up building you your largest amount of wealth so far. So we're looking forward to seeing you on the next video. Until then, make it a great day and keep on cash flowing. Take care.